Hello, BookTube. It's Tuesday, and that means Tag Tuesday, when we all stop what we're doing and do whatever tag is catching our interest. And I picked today the knitting book tag. And to show my conviction, I'm wearing my knitting swag. I've got my knitted gloves and my knitted hat there, even though it's considerably too warm for this kind of accoutrement in Boston and may stay too warm for the foreseeable future. I just thought it would be perfect complement to this video, which is all about knitting. It was a tag all about knitting. It was created by Wilde Book Garden, and I saw it on Hannah's books, even though she completely ignored me in terms of tagging me. I am not a crafty person. I am very much an enthusiastically happy receiver of the crafts of others, definitely. But for when it comes to knitting myself, crocheting or whatever it is, I not only don't have the patience, I don't think, but I also have almost no sense of touch. So fiddling around with sharp needles has always struck me as not a good idea any more than cooking. But I can still answer the questions. Questions are about books. And question number one is Cast Off. The first section you scope out in a bookstore / library / online book shopping. For me, that is new releases and, if possible, online, for instance, forthcoming releases. I love to see that sort of thing. There have been many, many times in retail bookstores where I don't look at anything else but the new releases. Why would I? Virtually anything that's back there, virtually anything that's in the back stacks of the store is available to me in some way or other and would only be an indulgence of an idle hour. It wouldn't be business, so to speak. Whereas new releases, forthcoming books, that is right up my alley. That's something I want to know about, especially if something's got by me. It used to be a horrifying experience. I used to go to the Barnes & Noble, the big Barnes & Noble in Boston. There isn't one now, but once upon a time there was one. I used to go to their new release section. I remember how horrifying / enjoyable it was to go to their new release section and see a new release on the table that I'd never heard of from anybody. I'd never got a word about it from a publicist, had no advance copy, had no finished copy. That was always horrifying because it meant a gap, and when you see a gap like that, you're wondering... When you see a gap like that, you're wondering, well, what other things are you missing? But also thrilling, because I admit, there's an element of fun to encountering something like that out in the wild, just in person. Prompt number 2 is knit. Obviously a staple of knitting. A super hyped book that completely delivered for you. Here I want to echo Hannah's choice in her video, which is the Wolf Hall books of Hilary Mantel. Let's concentrate on just Wolf Hall, the first book itself, which had all the fanfare in the world and deserved it. Absolutely deserved it. And deserves it still. The Wolf Hall books are amazing. So if you're looking at all of that universal hype and thinking, well, I'm bound to be disappointed, it can't live up to this, this is an instance in which it can. Believe you me. If you scan the critical horizon about any book, and you find that on that book, Christopher Hitchens and myself were in complete agreement, then you know the hype is deserved. So I'm going to say Wolf Hall. Prompt number 3 is Purl, P-U-R-L, knitting and purling. And as important as the knit stitch, but probably not as famous, name a character you think deserves more love. From fandom, the author, other characters, etc. I'm not going to pick so much a character as I am an author. And it is on my mind because of Wolf Hall. And the author is Susanna Dunn, who's written a small shelf of Tudor historical fiction. And it is strange. It's in some ways very contemporary, very anachronistic, but also beautiful. Amazingly heartfelt. I can't recommend her strongly enough. I don't know why she's never taken off. She's this weird caesura between Philippa Gregory and Hilary Mantel when there should have been 3. And there isn't. I don't know why that is. It could be marketing in this country, or a low profile on her part. I don't know why it is, but her books are great. Her Tudor fiction is great. Then prompt number 4 is chart. These are all knitting arcana. All these prompts are. A book or author you've been meaning to read but somehow just haven't got around to, and why? For me, the main thing that comes to mind in this regard is December books. I'm still collecting and requesting and collating December books, the last books of the year. I'm not going to read any later than that. I'm not going to read beyond that, except in the 3 instances when I couldn't resist. But otherwise, no 2023 releases. And I'm not there, but I'm pretty much caught up on what I want to read of November releases. There'll be plenty of rereading, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of surprises. But mainly for me, it's December releases. Then prompt number 5 is Double Pointed Needles. Recommend a series that you can actually read out of order and one that people might think you can, but you actually can't. I don't know of any. No real examples come to mind of the latter, but the former, I mentioned, I jotted down here, The Centennial History of the American Civil War by Bruce Catton, which it's a trilogy, and you don't need to read it in order. And that's not just because you know who won and who lost in the American Civil War, at least I hope you do. It's that the books are marvelously self-contained. They're just beautifully, beautifully done. And I've thought that for a long time, but it was only with the advent of BookTube that I was able to prove it to myself, because Jordan Parsons and I did a read-along of one volume in that series, and it wasn't the first one. And it was the only volume that he's read in the series, and he loved it. And I loved the experience, so those of you who read along with it didn't feel like you were left out at all. So I'm going to say Bruce Catton. Then number 6 is Cables, a book you heard negative reviews for, but you ended up loving. And I have to confess, this made me go all meta, this prompt, because I started to wonder, who writes negative reviews? Unless the prompt is thinking about Goodreads or Amazon, but I automatically filtered it through my own professional book reviewing, in some mainstream venue of some kind or other. And when I thought about it that way, I started thinking, well, when's the last time you read an explicitly negative review? Every once in a while, someone will be let off their chain at the New York Times. Famously, there was famously a hilariously negative review of Jared Kushner's book. But in the workaday world, most book section editors have a philosophy of, well, if there's nothing good to say about it, then let's just, as they say, the universal phrase is, bury it in silence. Let's bury it in silence and only talk about the books that are worth praising, at least in some degree. I've had many, many editors over the decades tell me that, say, I'm not saying that you should cheerlead for this book. You don't have to say that it's perfect. But if there's nothing positive that you can say about a book, then I'd rather not devote the space to it. Let's just bury it in silence. And you don't talk back to your editor if you want to come back to them for more work. But I always want to say to those editors, but it's not in silence. The book is being shipped to bookstores, and it has a publicity budget. It's being advertised. The author is doing the rounds at Politics and Prose or whatever. It's not in silence. The book isn't in silence. We are not burying it in silence. What we are doing is robbing it of a counterpoint. And that's not good, because we're not, and I guess maybe unless you're a paper of record, the New York Times, something like that. But even there, I would argue that that's just an illusion. What you are there for is the reader. And the reader is not going to, if the reader is going to take your silence as consent, right? Silence gives consent. They're going to think, well, you're thinking this isn't any damage to my time or my attention or my wallet. It won't be any damage to me, or you'd have told me. So although I didn't read a book review from you praising this book, I didn't read one condemning it either, so I'll get it and give it a try. I think that there's a danger of that happening. I think that negative book reviews have a real good purpose in the world, which is why I tend to write quite a few of them on Open Letters Review. Let's see here. And in answer, the question doesn't apply anyway, because to me anyway, because I'm almost always first to a book. If it's a new release, I'm almost always. It's almost always the case with a new release, a much hyped new release, for instance, which is the large bulk of what I read. That there won't be a body of opinion out there when I get to it. There'll be almost nothing or nothing. So I'm just gonna skip the question. It's making me all meta. Number 7 is Skein. Why do we still sell yarn like this? A trope you can't stand. One gimmick that's current in romance novels now that I don't particularly like is the word grumpy and the description grumpy. The whole, well, he's he's a 10, and he could be caring, and he might end up being the father of your children, but he's really grumpy. Uh, when I have seen it used in contemporary romances, it almost always is shorthand for uh, author laziness. Almost always, the author is trying to present you with a person who's not a complete poster child of likability, which none of us is. Only instead of the author making that realistic and believable, or having, God forbid, the grumpy character work against it, the author will just label them that, and that way they get it. They get what they consider to be a perfect excuse for the character to make rude comments in Starbucks. I don't like it. I'm hoping that it burns itself out. It doesn't strike me that it has a lot of legs, so it probably will. Then prompt number 8 is gauge, swatch, share an author who is always a good fit for you. I mention this author all the time. I don't think I've made many converts. Samuel Eliot Morison is a good fit for me at all times, no matter what. Because not so much of the subjects that he picks, because of how wonderfully he picks them, how wonderfully he writes them. There's pretty much nothing that I could pick up by him that wouldn't just pull me in. To the extent that I often resist doing that, because when I've got other reading to do, I often resist the urge to pick up some book of his and just start reading. Let's see here. Number 9 is stitch marker. Share a specific scene that stands out clearly in your mind. No spoilers. I'm pretty sure that I can avoid spoilers here, since I'm, again, guessing that a lot of you know how World War II started and ended. But there's a scene, I have a book right here, that I want to read to you. I'm not going to be a fiction thing, because it's nonfiction November. But I love it, and it reads as good as fiction. This is from Palmer and Colton's History of the Modern World, which is, on the surface, looks like just an ordinary textbook. That's certainly how I encountered it. But it is written with just electric energy to it. On the whole of really, it's the story of the 20th century, and it's amazing. I want to read you the subheading of one chapter called The End of Appeasement. I think I've read this before, but I love it so much, I'll read it again. The final disillusionment came in March 1939. Hitler marched into Bohemia Moravia, the really Czech part of Czechoslovakia, which he transformed into a German protectorate. Exploiting Slovak nationalism, he declared Slovakia independent. Czechoslovakia, merely trimmed down at Munich, now disappeared from the map. Having promised to take only a bite, Hitler swallowed the whole. He then seized Memo from Lithuania and raised demands for Danzig and the Polish corridor. A horrible realization now spread in France and Britain. It was clear that Hitler's most solemn guarantees were worthless, that his designs were not limited to Germans, but reached out to all Eastern Europe and beyond, that he was essentially insatiable, that he could never be appeased. In April 1939, his partner in aggression, Mussolini, took over Albania. That is delightful stuff. And that is that scene stands out for me. Nonfiction November, I'm always, whether I'm writing it or whether I'm reading it, I'm always thinking of what is nonfiction, including very standard nonfiction. If you're writing a textbook that you're expecting to be in schools, you're going to write standard nonfiction, no flights of fancy. That really stands out, and that is an example that does. Let's see here. Number 10 is yarn weight. Super useful info to take in at a glance. Do you have some bookish taste buddies? This could be someone you have really similar tastes in general for a specific kind of book. And the first thought that came to my mind here is no love for Steve. No love for Steve. Nobody wants Steve in their read-alongs. Nobody wants Steve in their buddy discords. Nobody wants Steve involved in any of that. No, they're perfectly happy to pal around with each other, but not Steve. I could probably have a whole bunch of book buddies, but no. Prop number 11 is that novelty yarn someone gifted you because they heard you like knitting, but it's impossible to work with. What's a book that looked perfect on paper but just didn't work out? I was interested to hear that this happens in the knitting world. Of course, we're all familiar with it happening in the book world, right? I say over and over again on this channel, don't give me a book. When it comes to a major gift-giving opportunity, don't give me a book. As natural as it might seem, you will give me a clunker. It's almost certain that you will. And I know that because I've had 100 clunkers given to me in my life. But my answer here is by Nicholas Jackson. It's a fairly new book called Trajan, Rome's Last Conqueror. And it's a biography of the Roman Emperor Trajan, about whom I know quite a bit. He's one of my favorite figures in history. He's one of my 5 guys. So you would think that a new biography of him would be right up my alley, but Trajan, Rome's last conqueror, did nothing for me at all. At all. So I'm not saying I was disappointed in the book, but I was disappointed that I didn't click with it. That's for sure. Then number 13 is socks. Handmade socks are way harder than they look. Talk about an unappreciated author who deserves more hype. Here I'll go not to Nonfiction November, but to another November event on BookTube, and that is New Worlds November, celebration of science fiction that was created by the Bookish Bryants last year. And here I want to pick the author Sterling Lanier, and specifically his books about Hero Destine, Hiero Destine, a warrior monk in a post-apocalyptic future who travels the land righting wrong and fighting villains with the aid of his genetically engineered genetic combination of a moose and a morse named Klutz. These books are really evocative. They have they're serious. They're totally serious. I'm chuckling, but they're totally serious, and they are really, really good. Here, the Unforsaken Hero is one of those volumes, and it's terrific. I think the other's Hero's Journey. I think there were only 2. And I strongly recommend The Unforsaken Hero if you can find it. I would love to find a copy. I haven't had a mass market. It had a Darrell K. Sweet cover, and I haven't had that copy in 30 years. No idea where I would ever find another one. But I do recommend that. Oh, did I skip a question? Yes, I did. I skipped prompt number 12, Scarf. The Perfect Starter Project. Recommend a good book for getting into a genre or a kind of book. Here I want to recommend, it's a fat thing, but you won't feel it at all. It's None Died in Vain by Robert Leckie. Recommended this book many times before. It's a 1-volume history of the American Civil War, and it's tremendously readable. Tremendously readable. Catton, Morrison, Leckie, they all learned their narrative history chops from the masters, and that's not really done anymore. So they were aware of the fact that in addition to their research, they had to tell a good story, and they do. So I'll recommend None Died in Vain. Pretty sure it's not in print, but you can probably find a copy. Then we move on to prompt number 14, Cast Off. A weirdly specific thing you love. Could be a trope, something in book construction, etc. I do have something that I want to mention here. It's rarer and rarer as production costs go up, but it's floppy binding. A paperback, or even a hardcover, but I'm talking about a paperback that you really can't break the spine. The paper and the glue, the backing is really floppy, so that it can take a lot of abuse without showing it. The old Penguin Classics used to be like that, every one of them. I don't know of a new book that I've bought from a bookstore in the last probably 5 or 6 years that has had anything like that. Most of them are so stiff they're even hard to open. So I'm going to say floppy binding. And then number 15 is Crafting Party. Honestly, one of the best parts of any hobby is sharing it with friends. Tag some people who craft or who might like to answer the questions. I have no idea who on BookTube crafts and who doesn't. I wasn't tagged in this tag, so I'm tagging you. If you saw this, I would love your answers to these questions. And that's it. That is the knitting book tag for Tag Tuesday with my knitting accoutrements on. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.